As Chinese military exercises and harassment in the Taiwan Strait become the norm, the possibility of Beijing blockade Taiwan has become a major risk, and Beijing has repeatedly made public the possibility of blockade Taiwan. So does China have the capacity to completely blockade Taiwan? And if so, what price will Beijing have to pay? Of the various branches involved in Beijing's military operations near Taiwan, Navy, Air Force, Rocket Force, Army, and support units, it is the Navy that would bear the brunt of any serious blockade effort. Other branches like the Air Force would play only a supporting role, and participation by other forces would likely be limited and ineffective. Back in August 2022, China's Rocket Force fired 11 missiles into the waters surrounding Taiwan. But in a true blockade scenario, indiscriminate missile launches would be problematic. They would severely disrupt critical maritime and air routes and provoke strong international backlash. Moreover, with Chinese ships operating nearby, the risk of accidental friendly fire is high. And Beijing harbors doubts about the precision of weapons like the DF-15 and DF-16 missiles. Given the unpredictability of missile trajectories, Beijing is wary of using long-range missile strikes. A strategy of repeatedly designating no-go zones around Taiwan's waters every 2 weeks to halt shipping would be unsustainable, as no global shipping power would tolerate it. Meanwhile, Chinese fighters perform near-daily harassment flights over the Taiwan Strait, skirting Taiwan's southwest and north, and sometimes making brief appearances southeast of the island. However, Chinese fighter jets are cautious about approaching Taiwan's northeast. Yonaguni Island, belonging to Japan, lies a mere 108 kilometers away. And any incursion into that airspace would instantly bring them under Taiwanese and Japanese missile lock. Thus, flights in that sector are notably rare and careful. Whenever Chinese aircraft near this sensitive northeastern area, Taiwan and Japan scramble fighters to intercept. Persistent intrusions could ignite a dangerous military standoff between China and Japan. Patrolling southeastern Taiwan is already stretching China's air force thin. Venturing northeast would create an even bigger operational strain. Talk of an air blockade remains largely theoretical, as Beijing simply lacks the means to seal off Taiwan's skies. Current harassment flights usually occur during daylight and often conclude by noon, but a true blockade would demand relentless 24-hour patrolling by fighter and early warning aircraft, even if China's Eastern Theater Command Air Force attempted this. It would soon face exhaustion. Continuous deployment would grind down both pilots and planes, increasing operational risks. Mechanical reliability issues, inadequate maintenance infrastructure, and limited airbase support would quickly surface. Ultimately, the Chinese Air Force would likely have no choice but to scale back and abandon the air blockade attempt, leaving the burden of a maritime blockade to the Chinese Navy alone. How sustainable is a Chinese naval blockade of Taiwan? On April 1 to 2, the Chinese military rushed through a joint drill around the island. The Shandong Carrier Strike Group slipped through the Bashi Channel and moved into the waters southeast of Taiwan. At that point, Taiwan's defense forces picked up 19 Chinese naval vessels operating nearby. Yet within 48 hours, more than half, including the Shandong, had withdrawn. The Eastern Theater Command Navy has a total of 9 Type 052D destroyers, 4 Type 052C destroyers, and 4 Russian-built Sovereignty-class destroyers. All of these ships are based in Zhoushan, Zhejiang Province, about 500 kilometers from Taiwan. Given maintenance needs and readiness cycles, not all can be deployed simultaneously. Generally, half are available for operations while the other half undergo repairs or remain on standby. This leaves about 8 or 9 destroyers operational at any time, a figure far short of what's needed for a full blockade effort. The Eastern Theater Fleet also includes 19 Type 054A frigates. Again, assuming half are deployed, that adds another 9 or 10 ships to the force. Combined with the destroyers, the Chinese side would muster about 17 to 19 warships. This number mirrors the scale of the recent drill, but sustaining a deployment like that around Taiwan for 1 or 2 months would demand constant logistical support. 3 supply ships from the Eastern Theater would need to shuttle non-stop between base and fleet to keep up with fuel and food requirements. Otherwise, individual warships would have to retreat for resupply, weakening the blockade. deploying 17 to 19 ships to cover Taiwan's south, east, and north, around 6 ships per sector, raises serious doubts about maintaining a 24-hour seal. For example, Taiwan's eastern coastline spans about 300 kilometers. To cover it with only 6 ships, each would need to patrol a 50-kilometer gap, far too wide to intercept every vessel. If 2 commercial ships appeared at once, Chinese forces might only be able to intercept one, letting the other slip through. The Eastern Theater also has 19 Type 056A corvettes, but their small size, just 1,440 tons, limits their usefulness for interception. Against massive cargo vessels weighing tens of thousands of tons, a Type 056A risks catastrophic damage in a collision. The plan could augment its numbers with the Type 056A fleet, but these corvettes are better suited for surveillance and backup, not frontline interdiction. Following this model, destroyers and frigates would operate in shifts, with supply ships racing to keep them fueled and fed. Such operations would lay bare China's vulnerabilities in endurance and logistics. Whether the Eastern Theater alone could handle months of sustained blockade pressure remains uncertain. To bolster the effort, China's Central Military Commission might have to pull in forces from the Northern and Southern Theater commands, stretching supply lines even thinner and complicating operations further. The naval assets of China's Northern Theater Command include the Liaoning aircraft carrier, 4 Type 055 destroyers, 9 Type 052D destroyers, a pair of older 051 and 052 destroyers, and 10 frigates from the 054A and 054B classes. However, they cannot all be deployed to enforce a blockade around Taiwan. Half must remain behind to safeguard China's interests in the Yellow Sea and East China Sea. The other half would have to rotate in and out, split into 2 groups, each consisting of around 3 destroyers and 2 to 3 frigates, limiting the level of support. These vessels are based in Qingdao and Dalian, both a daunting 1,200 kilometers away from Taiwan in a straight line. The long distance makes deployment and resupply far more challenging. The Northern Theater Command's 4 supply ships would need to operate non-stop to keep pace. Should the Liaoning carrier join the blockade force, the situation would become even more complicated. More escort destroyers would be needed, overwhelming the supply fleet and hollowing out defenses in northern waters. If the destroyers prioritize carrier escort duties, fewer ships would be available to enforce the blockade elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Southern Theater Command Navy's strength lies in the Shandong carrier, 4 Type 055 destroyers, and a handful of other modern and older destroyers, 2 each of the 052A, 052B, and 051B classes. Yet, they would confront challenges similar to those faced by the Northern Theater. The Southern Command also shoulders the heavier burden of defending strategic islands and reefs in the South China Sea, with the constant specter of U.S. and Allied forces adding to the strain. Initially, the Chinese Navy produced 22 Type 056 frigates, but these ships performed poorly and were reassigned to the Coast Guard, mainly tasked with chasing down small boats and fishing vessels, with a displacement of just 1,440 tons, matching the upgraded 056A model. They are ill-suited for intercepting large cargo ships weighing tens of thousands of tons. These Coast Guard vessels, stripped of heavier weapons like cannons and missiles, are mainly useful for low-intensity gray zone operations. But if a confrontation escalates during an actual interception, these ships would be at a severe disadvantage. Weather poses another serious challenge. Monsoon seasons bring rough seas, and while larger destroyers can handle these conditions, frigates like the 054AB and 056A models face a higher risk of accidents. During heavy storms, they would be forced to withdraw to port, disrupting any ongoing blockade efforts. Should a typhoon strike, an evacuation of all Chinese naval forces would become inevitable. While some environmental risks are predictable, others, especially those involving operational readiness and external confrontations, are far harder to control. The risk of accidental clashes looms large once Chinese warships move into the waters surrounding Taiwan. Taiwan's navy will inevitably respond, shadowing and challenging the Chinese ships. As brief standoffs evolve into prolonged confrontations, the probability of accidental engagements will rise sharply. Meanwhile, Chinese vessels won't only be dealing with Taiwan, navies from multiple countries will soon join the fray. Taiwanese forces must not only defend their own waters but also ensure Chinese warships do not disrupt merchant vessels bound for their ports. Merchant ships of other nations, if harassed by Chinese forces, will resist as well. The U.S. 7th Fleet is expected to deploy rapidly. Prepared to shield commercial traffic and to engage directly if necessary, Washington will not tolerate Chinese interference with U.S. or Allied shipping. American warships will strive to create safe corridors, physically separating Chinese warships from merchant ships when needed, which will raise the odds of serious incidents. Japan's vital trade routes will also come under threat, prompting the Japan Self-Defense Forces to assist in the escort operations alongside the U.S. military. Given the pattern of Chinese ships passing through the Miyako Strait and near Taiwan's east coast, Japan will likely intensify naval and aerial patrols. Should Chinese vessels navigate between Taiwan and Yonaguni Island, direct naval face-offs between China and Japan would be unavoidable. In response, the United States would surge more forces into the Western Pacific, coordinating with Australia, Canada, and NATO members to assemble a combined escort fleet. This coalition would seek to safeguard maritime traffic around Taiwan, just as Western navies have done recently in the Red Sea. European nations like Britain, France, and Germany would dispatch ships, and both British and French aircraft carriers could steam toward the Indo-Pacific theater. Confronting so many foreign navies would be an overwhelming task for China, as no major power would tolerate Beijing's attempts to control international shipping lanes. The more nations that send warships into the area, the higher the chances of a miscalculation leading to gunfire. A multinational naval coalition would form rapidly, and any hostile move by China could ignite a broad military conflict, dooming any hope of sustaining a blockade on Taiwan. Should full-scale war erupt, the United States and its allies would possess a decisive edge in both sea and air power. The Chinese Navy would find itself heavily outmatched and face swift devastation. Key coastal military bases could be pounded from the air. If Beijing presses on regardless, attempting to maintain the blockade, diplomatic isolation would intensify. In retaliation, the United States and its allies might unleash sweeping sanctions and military blockades against China. They could choke off the Strait of Malacca and intercept Chinese merchant ships throughout the Indian Ocean, cutting off vital supplies like Middle Eastern oil. Under such crushing pressure, Beijing would be left no option but to abandon its blockade and accept defeat. Although Beijing may have long toyed with the idea of blockading Taiwan, Chinese leaders clearly understand the immense difficulty of pulling it off, and the grave risks it carries. They fear not only provoking a global backlash but also being drawn into a disastrous war with foreign powers, a gamble Xi Jinping simply cannot afford to lose. Internally, Xi faces another, even deeper threat, one he is obsessively wary of and constantly tries to purge from the ranks: disloyalty within the military's upper echelons. A descendant of high-ranking cadres with inside knowledge recently revealed that many senior officers harbor resentment against Xi and secretly hope for a war over Taiwan to erupt. In the event of open conflict, these discontented officers see an unprecedented chance to stage a rebellion and topple Xi's rule. Alarmingly, General Miao Hua, whom Xi personally entrusted with overseeing military appointments, has reportedly cultivated a network of loyalists ready to act if granted operational authority. Intelligence gathered during investigations last year exposed Miao Hua's ties to an astonishing 1,300 officers, including nearly 100 generals and lieutenant generals. Thus, any order from Beijing to initiate a blockade or military campaign against Taiwan would not just endanger China's external security, it could fatally undermine Xi's grip on power. With so much internal instability and external danger looming, it seems increasingly unlikely that China will dare to move aggressively against Taiwan in the near future.